well, I'd like to welcome everyone to Travel Tuesday, and we have a real treat in store tonight with our talk on Cyprus. But I would like to begin, as I have begun each one of these Travel Tuesday talks, by introducing to you a staff member from Australians studying abroad. I think quite the best tour company in the entire world. Yeah. So tonight, I would like to introduce you to Sandra Hanson. And Sandra is a very long-standing member of the ASA team and a much valued part of the team. She's in charge of marketing and publicity, but she actually joined the company in the late 1990s. So she has been with ASA for a very long time. And of course has been involved in planning tours and suggestions as to where tours ought to be going and in all of the daily running of ASA. So Sandra, welcome.
Yes, I'm looking at names and I know a lot of names, haven't necessarily seen the faces. So here's mine for what it's worth. And it's lovely to listen to people come back and tell their stories of how much they've enjoyed the programs, because we really enjoy putting them together. Enjoy tonight. I'm sure Chris will mesmerise you all and you'll all want to join him on his many adventures that he's doing with us.
Thank you, Sandra. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Christopher Gribbin. Chris did his PhD in classics and he has taught at Melbourne, La Trobe and Monash universities. And Chris loves to share his passion for the literature and the architecture of the ancient world. He has specialised particularly in ancient Greece and Rome. Chris is also involved in a summer school every January with the Hellenic Museum, and that is open to everybody. He is leading for ASA a tour to Cyprus, civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. And that tour will be going in October of this year. And I believe it's nearly fully booked, so move fast if you're keen to get a booking for that. But it will also be available in October next year, 2024. So tonight, Chris will be talking to us about the wealthy world of Bronze Age Cyprus.
So yeah, I want to talk about Cyprus tonight, and I wanted to start off with a little bit of background in terms of the geography of Cyprus, because the geography plays a really important role throughout its history in shaping the culture of Cyprus, in shaping the way that it interacts with the rest of the world, and in shaping what happens there. So Cyprus is this island over here in the northeast corner of the Mediterranean, and the Mediterranean plays a really important role in its history because the Mediterranean is something that both connects Cyprus to other cultures, but also separates Cyprus from other cultures. So in terms of its role as a connector, Cyprus is not very far away from land around it. So it's only about 70 kilometers from Cyprus to Anatolia, the south coast of Turkey. It's only 100 kilometers away from the Levant, from the coast of Syria. And even going a little bit further, it's 350 kilometers from Cyprus to Egypt and 395 kilometers from Cyprus to Rhodes. And then the island of Rhodes is kind of the gateway to the Aegean. So if you can get yourself to Rhodes, you're then connected into a whole trade network of islands that are now all part of Greece, as well as the western coast of Turkey. So the Mediterranean acts very much as a sort of highway that enables goods to move throughout this kind of area. Many parts of the Mediterranean, you'll find the land has barriers that divides communities from other communities on the land. So either in the case of Greece, for example, there's a lot of mountains that make it difficult to move from one part to another on the land. If you have a look along the southern Mediterranean, of course, there's a desert that makes it difficult to move things inland. So people naturally in the Mediterranean tend to look to the sea as a way of moving themselves and of moving goods. It's also a much cheaper way of moving things in large quantities. So the Mediterranean is in a lot of ways the highway of the ancient world. It's one of the things that I think is always interesting for us coming from Australia. We tend to think of the oceans as things that separate us from other places, being where we are very far away from other countries with large, long oceans in between us. We tend to look at the water as that separating thing. But for the Mediterranean, where everything is much closer together, it's quite the opposite. It's actually the thing that tends to connect different places together. And that's played a really important role in Mediterranean history because it enables the different areas that have different advantages, that have are able to grow different crops, that have different natural resources and so on, to connect to each other much more easily. So the Mediterranean, very much something that joins and connects Cyprus to the cultures around it. And this is really reinforced as well by the way that the currents work in this eastern part of the Mediterranean. Because if you have a look at the way that the water tends to flow, it tends to go in this big anti-clockwise circle. And that means that the easiest way to get something from, say, Egypt to Greece isn't to go in the most direct straight line, but it's to sail up the coast of Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and then along past Cyprus to get to Greece and then to sail back. You can take a bit of a shortcut. But this loop means that anybody wanting to trade in this part of the Eastern Mediterranean inevitably has to sail past Cyprus, and that puts Cyprus in this really important position as a kind of crossroads between the different cultures around it. So that, as I say, is one aspect of the Mediterranean, is this thing that connects these different places together. But at the same time, Cyprus is far enough away from these different cultures that there's a little bit of a barrier between it and the places around it. And that means that Cyprus, while it's very often influenced by the other cultures around it, it will often tend to adopt and adapt different aspects of material culture, and so on. But it's separate enough to be able to do its own thing. And so right through Cypriot history, right from the very first stage of the prehistory, right through to modern history, Cyprus always tends to do things slightly differently to what the other places around it are doing. Sometimes it will get caught up in the big historical events that are around it, sometimes it doesn't. And so this tension really between the connectivity and separateness becomes this really major theme that runs through the whole of Cyprus's history. And it's something that makes it an interesting and I think quite a distinct place, in that it's doing something that's quite different from anyone else. It's often taking things from multiple different cultures and mixing them together. Sometimes it's inventing its own way of doing things. And the importance that it plays in history in this part of the world tends to vary quite considerably depending on what's happening around it as well. So it's a really dynamic sort of place. It's a really dynamic sort of history, and it's one that's quite unique in terms of the society as well. As to the actual island itself, if we zoom in and have a bit of a look there are three major geographic aspects of it. There's the Kyrenea Mountains that go along the northern coast there. There's the Troodos Mountains that are in kind of the south central bit, and these ones are incredibly important in Cypriot history for two major reasons. One is that they are an excellent source of timber, so that is really useful if you want to build ships to connect to other people. And the other thing is that they are very rich in copper deposits that are near the surface. So that means that it has a wonderful resource in abundance that it can export out to its neighbours. So that becomes a really important part of its history as well. And then between these two mountain chains, you have this large plain in the middle. And that large plain also plays a really important role. It's fed by a number of rivers that come off those mountain ranges, and that provides a great resource for agriculture on the island. It means that unlike a lot of Mediterranean islands, particularly a lot of those Greek islands, which can really struggle to have enough space to feed themselves, Cyprus has this large area of productive land that it can look after itself, as well as having these extra goods that it can sell in the terms of timber and copper as well. The other aspect of the geography that really works in Cyprus's favour is that there are a number of bays right around the coast there. So there's a number of places where you can get good anchorages for ships, which facilitates that international trade. That's enough of the geography. In terms of humans, We find that the earliest evidence for people on Cyprus comes from somewhere around 11,000 or 10,000 BC. And initially what it seems is that they are temporary visitors rather than settlers. They're people who will come over there, do a bit of hunting, and then head back to wherever they happen to live, whether that's on Anatolia or over on the Syrian coast or somewhere along those lines. So the first evidence for humans is a bit scattered, and as I say, it seems to be temporary. And the first permanent settlers seem to arrive somewhere around about in the 8000s BC, coming from the Levant, that eastern coast of the Mediterranean. What they found there was an island which was quite distinct in terms of its animals that it had on it. There are a couple of really unusual types of animals that were found on Cyprus, including dwarf hippopotamus and dwarf elephants as well. So this is one of these weird things that you tend to have happen on islands. You have a combination of there being no major predators, plus limited amounts of food, and these two factors put on an evolutionary pressure to shrink the animals down a bit. So you end up with animals that went across to Cyprus as full-sized elephants and hippos that over time shrink down into these tiny little ones. Unfortunately, these dwarf hippos and elephants become extinct about the same time as humans arrive on the island. I'm not pointing any fingers, but you can make your own conclusions on that one. Instead, what we find is that shortly after humans arrive, they decide to replace these unique animals with all of the regular animals that they find so helpful. So they introduce sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, deer, cats, dogs, foxes, and mice, and so on. Bring them all across into the island and turn it into something that is a little bit more familiar to them. In terms of the way that the people live in these early times, they tended to live in small villages, generally made up in the beginning of round houses, and several of these villages have been preserved. It's one of the things that's really exciting about Cyprus is that there are a whole lot of different phases of history where the remains have been preserved. We have wonderful things that we can get an idea of what things were like in prehistory. You have a lot of evidence for ancient Greek and Roman times. There's medieval remains, there's modern things. So there's a whole lot of these sort of things all sort of sitting next to each other that makes for something that's really very engaging. And I don't want to go too far into, I want to really concentrate on the Bronze Age today, but I think it's worth giving you a bit of a sense of what life was like before the Bronze Age on Cyprus. And so I just wanted to quickly show you the site of Kitakitia. What we have here is a site from between about 7,000 and 4,000 BC. It's a collection of circular buildings sitting on a hill. Most of the buildings are about 2 to 3 meters in diameter. There's a few larger ones which go up to about 9 meters, which maybe had some sort of communal purpose. And sometimes we find several of these buildings grouped together with a courtyard to create a little bit of a compound. They are, as you can see, made of stone foundations. Those foundations would originally have had mud brick on top, which would have been plastered. And we can see a reconstruction of what they looked like there on the site. So it gives you a bit of a sense for what these little homes would have looked like at that time. We know as well from the excavations that there were various fragments of painted decoration and there may have been windows. There's a bit of theorising that goes on there. That gives you a little bit of a sense for what life was like in prehistoric Cyprus. I don't want to dwell on that. I really want to skip ahead to the late Bronze Age, which begins in this part of the world around about 1650 BC, which is what I really want to focus on tonight. By the time we get to this period, the population of Cyprus has grown considerably. We find people living in much larger settlements. There is a number of new technologies that are introduced in this period. There's various cultural changes that have happened. But most important of all, Cyprus has become an important part of a larger interconnected world thanks to its copper deposits. So the copper on Cyprus was mined since about the 25th century BC, so about 1,000 years before the late Bronze Age. And Trade has always been happening on Cyprus. They've always been connected to the people around them. But it's in this period from about the 17th century BC that the scale of copper mining and the scale of trade increases very markedly. And as I say, Cyprus becomes an integral part of what is very much an interconnected world. It's sometimes referred to as the globalized Mediterranean, because a lot of those features that we tend to talk about when we talk about globalization were there on a smaller sort of scale happening during this period. So what we find is that there are a number of developed civilizations in the vicinity of Cyprus, as you can see there. In particular, we find, for example, there's Egypt that's hanging on down the bottom here. You can see Egypt, the Hittites in blue up here, and the Mycenaean Greeks that are in this pinky purple sort of color. And Cyprus, as you can see, is right in the middle of these different people. These people are all trading and interacting with each other, and Cyprus is very conveniently right in the middle. The other thing that's really important to understand, this is the period of the Bronze Age. Bronze is the most important metal. It's an incredibly crucial part of the military equipment. It's a crucial part of farming equipment. It's essential for these civilizations to survive and to thrive. So Cyprus, as a place that's in the middle of these, that has a wonderful supply of copper, is something that is suddenly very, very important. As I say, this period has a kind of a globalization. There's trade happening throughout between all of these different cultures. We know that there was a lot of movement of people happening through this period. We find, for example, that there are painters who move from Greece to Egypt in order to do their work, various other bits and pieces, sailors that are moving from one place to another as well. Many of the cultures during this period have these sort of somewhat centralized, what we refer to as palace economies. So they tend to have these very large, powerful palaces, which are controlling at least some aspects of their economies. And we know that there was a lot of interaction between the various kings of these different places. We know that the kings were trading with each other. They were frequently marrying each other's daughters. There was warfare happening between the kings, all the things that you would expect to be happening at this time. And we know about a lot of this because they tended to write letters to each other a lot. And fortunately, a number of these letters have been preserved. They tended to write them on clay tablets, and here's an example of these clay tablets, which were then stored in the palaces. And when conditions are right, particularly when the palace tends to burn down, often these clay tablets will then get fired in the fire and will end up being very well preserved, and something that we can now read, that we can get a bit of an understanding and an insight into what times were like in this period. It's also really interesting that there was essentially a common diplomatic language throughout all of this area, which is Akkadian, which is what you can see written in there. So even though each of these different places had their own language, and in a number of places had their own writing systems as well, they had this common diplomatic language that they could write to each other in, so that they had the ability to communicate with each other throughout. And as I say, in this period, Cyprus becomes an important part of this international world because largely of its copper resources. So Cyprus starts exporting copper, and it starts exporting it in bulk quantities as well. Typical thing that we find is what's referred to as an oxhide ingot, which looks like that. And these are between 25 to 28 kilograms each. So these are quite large, quite heavy pieces of copper. These are not intended for personal use. They are intended for bulk trade that's happening presumably largely between these various different kings that are controlling things. And Cyprus is able to export these in large enough quantities that it is able to start importing luxury goods in return. So we start to find during this period in Cyprus, the last half of the first millennium BC, a whole variety of luxury goods appearing in the archaeological record. We find items like this gold breastplate. And you can see often in a lot of these different items, you can see the influence of some of the neighboring cultures around there. So you can see some sort of Egyptian-ish looking sphinxes on this particular item. We find a lot of gold jewelry happening as well. This jewelry is either from the Aegean, so from the Greek world, or it's been made in Cyprus, but in that same sort of Aegean style. We find there's a couple of nice gold Cypriot earrings from this period that are actually on display in Melbourne at Melbourne's Hellenic Museum. If you want to go and have a look at that, you're welcome to do that. And we also find them importing other luxury goods such as ivory, as these two items had. There's no elephants on Cyprus anymore at this point, so ivory has to be imported from Africa and reworked at some point as well. So we start to find a whole lot of really luxury goods happening within the archaeological record at this time that starts to speak to the wealth of the society that we have. In terms of the scale of the trade, I think it's worth giving a couple of examples of that. One of those is one of the letters that's been preserved, which is a letter from one of the kings of Cyprus to the Egyptian pharaoh, where he apologizes because there's been a disease in Cyprus and that's caused disruption to the mining. He's not able to send the full amount of copper that he was supposed to send. He's only able to supply 13.5 tons of copper in this particular shipment. So that seems like a lot. Presumably the intended shipment was much larger than that, and that gives you a bit of a sense for the scale of trade that's happening. But I think the best illustration comes from actually a shipwreck that comes from a place called Uluburun, just off the coast of Turkey. And this is a shipwreck from about 1300 BC. It seems to have been on its way from either Egypt or the southern Levant over to Greece when it had an unfortunate incident and managed to sink. We're not sure whether this was a regular trading vessel or a special shipment from one king to another. We only have a few shipwrecks from this period, so it's hard to put it into much of a context. But because it sank with all of its goods on board and those goods were preserved on the bottom of the sea, we have a lot of insight into what was actually happening and what was going on there. We know that it contained about 10 tons of copper. You can see some of those oxide ingots stacked up on the left there. And this copper was either mostly or all from Cyprus, and that was accompanied also by a ton of tin. So when you want to make bronze, you have to combine copper and tin, and you do that in that ratio of 10 to 1. So 10 tons of copper to 1 ton of tin makes perfect sense. In terms of the origins of the tin, recent work on that has identified that about 2/3 of that tin came from Turkey, and 1/3 of it came from somewhere in Central Asia, somewhere around Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. So that to me is a really fascinating thing, gives you an insight into how wide these trade networks, that you're getting tin moving all the way overland from Central Asia to the Mediterranean, then getting itself on a ship where it's being combined together. Other items found on this shipwreck included resin, fruit and spice from Canaan, ebony logs from Nubia, which is the Sudan area, raw glass from Mesopotamia, pottery from Cyprus and from Canaan, hippopotamus and elephant ivory, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and all manner of other things as well. So, as I say, this is a really interconnected world where a whole lot of goods are being moved around all at the same time. It's a good illustration, that shipwreck, I think, of both the scale of trade and the size of the international networks. So all of this trade that Cyprus has managed to get itself involved with facilitates a period of major transformation and development for Cyprus. We find the destruction and abandonment of a number of old settlements and the founding of new settlements around the 17th, 16th century BC. We have an overall increase in the number of settlements happening. We get the development of larger settlements with people starting to engage in more and more specialized types of activities. And we also get the appearance of fortifications. We get weapons appearing in burials, warriors being depicted on pottery. That suggests that not everything was all happy and cooperative at all times. We also find the development of an elite class of people with various imported luxury goods happening in the burials and large monumental buildings appearing in cities. They're not on the scale of the palaces of the Near East and Greece and not as wealthy. And interestingly, whereas when we look at the Near East and Greece, in those cities that have been excavated there, we will often find there's one very large palace that controls the city. In Cyprus, we often see more than one of these large places happening, large buildings appearing within the one city. So there doesn't seem to be the same degree of centralization that's happening in other places. The archaeological evidence also suggests that there were multiple political units in Cyprus, that is, that it wasn't all one big country controlled by one particular king, but we've no idea of how many different political units there were or where their boundaries were. But we do know that the Cypriots had a strong international standing. In one of the letters, the Egyptian pharaoh addresses a Cypriot king as brother. So in this diplomatic language, they use these familial relationships to refer to the power dynamics often. So if you're a more powerful king than someone else, you'll refer to them as son, they'll refer to you as father. But if you're an equal, you will refer to each other as brother. So the fact that the Egyptian pharaoh is referring to a king in Cyprus as brother suggests that he has a significant standing that's equal to that of the Egyptian pharaoh. So I wanted to have a quick look at a couple of archaeological sites to get a bit more of an insight into what things were like in this period. The first one I want to have a look at is Kalavassos Aios Demetrius, which is a settlement from about 1450 to 1200 BC, so right in the middle of that late Bronze Age period in Cyprus. It's only been partially excavated, but what makes it particularly interesting is the building that you can see on the screen now, which is one of these elite residences. It's a large building. It's about 31 by 35 metres, which makes it about 1,000 square metres in total, possibly with a second story as well. It had a large courtyard in the middle that you can see happening there with the various rooms opening up off that. But what is particularly important and particularly interesting, I think, is that there was a large hall for storage. So there's a hallway to the side and you can see these various round objects through here. Each one of those had a large ceramic vase on top of it. There's a picture from the excavation and all the vases had been broken up in intervening years, but you can see various pieces there. These vases we can reconstruct from the pieces. They would have stood about 1.5 to 2 meters tall, and there was space for more than 50 of them. So that means that there was a total capacity of over 33,000 litres of goods being stored in this particular building. We think that they contained olive oil, so that's quite a large quantity. Obviously, that's significantly more olive oil than you're going to use for personal reasons. So clearly this palace was involved to some degree in trade, in controlling the economy and so on in relation to olive oil, presumably olive oil exports. There are also in this building seals that were used to create your seal on clay tablets, which suggests some sort of administration, and various evidence for feasting happening here as well. Sheep and goat bones and pottery vessels, including some which were imported from Greece, which suggests that this was all connected to, or was heavily involved in civic organisation, the control of resources, and entertaining other members of society as well. So it's a good illustration for some of the civic organisation that's happening at this time, but it's hard to say much more than that. It's hard to say who is benefiting and who this is being done for or on what scale. The other example I wanted to show you was the town of Enkemi. This is has been much more excavated than the Kalavassos Aios Demetrius. So Enkemi was founded a bit before the late Bronze Age when a fortress was built here. But in the 14th and 13th century, the city grew and became much larger and more prominent. It was then destroyed about 1200 BC and rebuilt, and what you can see today is primarily that stuff that was rebuilt after about 1200 BC. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this site is that you can see that the city was built on a grid system. This is in fact the first grid system for a city anywhere in Europe. So Cyprus can claim that as a bit of a source of pride as well. But that suggests a fair degree of central organisation. You can't have a grid system as something that just kind of evolves naturally using a whole lot of different people. Someone has to be controlling it. And other things that we find, there's also a large, if you have a look right about the centre of town, you'll see this large open space, which seems to be a sort of city square. And then if you have a look at the edge, you can see this large fortification wall, which is what's going on over here as well. Near the centre of town, we find a large building that is known as the Ashlar building. There you can see the remains of it. It's known as the Ashlar building because it has a number of these large stone blocks that we refer to as Ashlar blocks. These are something of a status symbol in Cyprus at this time, so the fanciest buildings tend to have these as they're built into their walls, whereas other buildings tend to be more of that kind of rubble construction, as you can see on the left there. That's your regular building material, but if you're very wealthy, you can control the resources to get yourself these very large ashlar blocks. This building, again, it's a similar size to the one at Kalavasos Ias Demetrius. It's about 925 square metres and seems to be primarily residential. In this case, there's no evidence for workshops or storage. It has a central room with a hearth, which seems to have been maybe some sort of feasting room, maybe some sort of throne room, something along those lines. We find, again, these Mycenaean Greek ceramic vessels that have been found in one of the rooms. There are also a couple of rooms here which seem to be shrines where some bronze figurines depicting gods were found, which I'm going to come back to shortly. That gives you a bit of a sense for what the archaeology, what the sites look like. In terms of the culture within Cyprus in this period, one of the interesting things we find is from about 1500 BC, we have the appearance of writing on Cyprus, probably mostly for administrative purposes. And what the Cypriots do is that they develop a unique writing system, which is referred to as the Cypro-Minoan syllabary, which is only used on Cyprus, apart from a couple of examples, presumably, of Cypriots living overseas. It's used on clay tablets, much like the Akkadian in that letter that I showed you earlier, but the characters are completely different. We find this mostly on clay tablets, but we also find it on seals. So there's an example of a seal. That's the actual cylinder seal on the left there. You roll it on a piece of clay, which gives you the picture that you can see on the right. The cylinder seal is a very Near Eastern thing, but the Cypriots have adapted that, but they've also then inserted their own characters on it. So you can see up along here and here some of those Cypro-Minoan characters. We also find Cypro-Minoan appearing on these little balls. They're about 2 to 3 centimetres in diameter. They have these letters or syllabic characters inscribed on them. The purpose of these balls is completely unknown. It's one of these great archaeological mysteries. There's a whole bunch of theories. Maybe they are gaming pieces. It's also been suggested they may be some sort of ID tokens. It's also been suggested that they may have a religious function. That's always what archaeologists suggest when they don't know what something is. It's, oh, it must be religious. We don't really know. It's a bit of a mystery, but we find a number of these clay balls inscribed with these characters in a number of different places. We know the sounds that these different symbols make, but we don't know that what the language was that the Cypriots were using, so we can't read any of it. It doesn't seem to be Greek. In later times, Greek is the predominant, not the only language on Cyprus, but it's the predominant language on Cyprus in the 1st millennium BC. But at this point, back in the 2nd millennium BC, they appear to be speaking some other language, which isn't Greek, and we don't know what it is, and we don't know what it says. It would be wonderful if we did. I'm sure we could get a lot of insights into Cypriot culture, but unfortunately, despite a whole lot of efforts, nobody has been able to crack the language and figure out what's going on. A couple of really interesting things about the particular writing system that the Cypriots adopt. One of them is that there was a common writing system throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, that cuneiform that was used to write Akkadian. We know that there were people on Cyprus who knew how to read and write using that system, but they chose not to do that. They chose not to use that. They chose to come up with a new and unique system that only they could read. Why? We don't know. It may be because they were valuing secrecy. This way they could write things to each other that only other Cypriots could read. It may have been a kind of island identity or pride, that they wanted to do things their own way to show their own importance. All of this is absolute theorization, but it's an interesting thing that they could have adopted something used more broadly but chose not to. And the other thing is that the system is derived from a system of writing used on Crete called Linear A. It's not copied from Linear A, it's not exactly the same, it's adapted from it. So it's similar to it. Some of the characters have things in common and some of them don't. Again, the question of why Crete, and we don't really have a good answer to that, but certainly the Cretans were important traders, and one theory is that the Cypriots were trying to get connected to that. So as much as the Cretans were recognised as important international traders, the Cypriots were keen to be part of that as well, and using this writing style may have been one way for them to do that. The other thing that we start to find appearing during this period in Cyprus is religious buildings. They tend to vary in design, but they typically include a freestanding rectangular building, often with ashlar masonry and a courtyard. So if you have a look at this, you can get a bit of a sense here. This is a building that would have been initially enclosed. You can see the ashlar blocks on the side there. There's a second one happening over there. And then in the middle is a courtyard that has some later things that have been built on top of it as well. We don't know much about Cypriot religion other than that it seems to have involved some sort of feasting at times. We find animal remains and ceramics that suggest communal feasting. We find ox bones that have been inscribed in a number of places in something that we think may have been connected with divination. And sometimes in sanctuaries, we tend to find these fabulous little figurines that can be found all over Cyprus that are quite unique. There are two types. One is referred to as the bird-faced, which you can see a good example of in the middle, and one of which is referred to as the flat-headed, which you can see an example of there on the right. They are mostly, not exclusively, but mostly female characteristics, generally with prominent breasts and pubic areas, sometimes holding infants, sometimes holding tambourines, and it's generally presumed that they represent some sort of fertility goddess, but it's also been suggested they may be priestesses, they may be meant to represent worshippers. They are found, as I say, in religious sanctuaries sometimes, but they are also found in many other places. We also find them in homes, we find them in burials as well. So sanctuaries is just one part of it. But these are, I think, they're really interesting. They're quite engaging little characters that very distinctively Cypriot during this period. In around about 1200 BC, we have a very important event happening in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is generally referred to as the Bronze Age collapse. It's a period of great disruption. So you can see all of these different sites, which are written there in red, are sites where there's been major disruptions, where there's been major, usually military problems. And what we find is there's sort of this wave of cities being attacked, being burnt down, being destroyed, happening around about 1200 BC. We have in some places, particularly in Greece and the Hittites, that's referred to as Hatti there in that particular diagram, we find the disintegration of the central state's administrative systems. We find the disappearance of the elite class. We find the end of that centralized economy that was characteristic of many places. We find settlements tend to shift, people are abandoning various sites, and population declines in some places, most especially Greece. We think that something like 50% of the population disappeared during this period in the 12th century BC through a combination probably of war, disease, and emigration as well. And there are major disruptions to the trade network. The trade network was partially based on these centralized economies. The kings played a major role in getting goods from one place to another and in organizing the trade network. And so when these collapse, then you find a real disruption to the trade network as well. There's a bit of an illustration of this. We have a letter from the king of Ugarit. Ugarit is on the Syrian coast, just over here. He writes a letter to one of the kings in Cyprus, and he tells us, my father, he's not referring to a biological relationship, but to, again, that fact that the king of Cyprus is a higher ranking king than the king of Ugarit. He says, my father, now the ships of the enemy have come. They have been setting fire to my cities and have done harm to the land. Doesn't my father know that all my infantry and chariotry are stationed in Kate, and that all my ships are stationed in the land of Lucca? They have not arrived back yet, so the land is thus prostrate. May my father be aware of this matter. Now the 7 ships of the enemy which have been coming have done harm to us. Now if other ships of the enemy turn up, send us a report somehow, so that I will know. There's a really nice little illustration, I think, of some of the desperation and disruption that's happening during this period. So we have this major disruption. The elites are collapsing in a whole lot of places. There's military activity happening. There's lots of cities being burnt down and destroyed. How bad was this period? That's something of an academic debate. Some people will argue for this being a complete collapse. Some people will say it was more of a transition. Certainly, it was definitely very disruptive, but it wasn't the end of everything. Trade does continue after this period, but it tends to happen at a much smaller scale. And while the population in a number of places declines, there's nowhere that becomes completely depopulated. It's also been argued that while this was definitely bad for the elites in a number of places, it might not have been bad for everyone in these places, that some of the peasant farmers may have been quite happy to see the elites disappear because they no longer had to be paying such high taxes and so on. And the other thing about this Bronze Age transition collapse is that it was not an evenly spread phenomenon. There are some areas that were much more affected than others. Greece was particularly badly affected. Cyprus was much less affected. What we find indeed in Cyprus is that there's a wave of disruption that's happening in the early 12th century, same as these things happening in other places as well. There are some sites that are damaged violently, others which are simply abandoned but have no signs of destruction. Then there are some sites that continue right through without any sort of disruption at all. So there's definitely something happening, but it's not as bad as what's happening in other places. And there's no evidence for a societal collapse the same way that we see in other places. The society certainly changes from this period, but there's also a significant amount of things that continue. And Cyprus doesn't really enter into the same sort of dark age. We tend to refer to the period after this, from the 11th century onwards, in Greece as a dark age because things really become very poor, very difficult, much less interaction happening with the rest of the world. Cyprus isn't suffering anywhere near the same extent. But that wider economic system of the Eastern Mediterranean does fall apart, and Cyprus has to adapt. What we find is that Bronze Age trade, as I mentioned, tended to be very much reliant on the kings, but now a lot of those kings have disappeared. So trade tends to be happening on a much smaller scale. So instead of these large 25 kilogram ingots of bronze that are being sold in bulk, we now find the Cypriots are producing and exporting smaller bronze items, like this bronze vessel stand, which can be traded at smaller quantities than those ingots. We also find from the 11th century, we find evidence for trade with Sardinia. And that's really interesting because Sardinia is also another major copper exporter. So why would Cyprus, a copper exporter, be trading with Sardinia, another copper exporter? And the theory that is the best on this one is that it may have been to access the tin networks that Sardinia had. Because though the tin that used to come across from Central Asia, those trade networks seem to have fallen apart during this period. But Sardinia seems to have managed to have a trade network going through Spain to Cornwall in England. So the goods were being moved across that way. And by Cyprus creating this connection with Sardinia, it was able to buy into that trade network as well, so that it could continue to be exporting bronze goods around to other places as well. Another interesting thing that seems to happen in this period is that we find some evidence for a connection between bronze working and religion in Cyprus. Now, this may have been about a new elite trying to institutionalize and legitimate its authority. It may have been a way to control some of the technology, the Bronze Age technology, and to keep it secret during a turbulent time. But we do find, as I say, a couple of really interesting things. One of them is these bronze figurines which were found in that central palace in Ankara that I mentioned before. The one on the left is referred to as the horned god. The one on the right is referred to as the ingot god. The horned god is about 50 centimeters tall. The ingot god is about 35 centimeters tall. And these are both made of bronze. And particularly the ingot god is a really interesting mix of different cultural elements, which really speaks to Cyprus and the way that it operated during this period. The pose of the figure seems to have been influenced by figurines from the Levant, which we refer to as the smiting god. But the shield that it's holding is a typical Hittite shield. The greaves, that armor that it's wearing on its legs, are typically Aegean. And the hat with the horns on it that we see on both of these characters is a typical Sardinian thing as well. But most importantly, the ingot god on the right there, if you have a look at its feet, it is standing on one of those oxhide ingots. So originally this figure we know was created without the oxhide ingot, but that was later welded onto it. And so that's been seen as evidence of the connection between religion, that we think these were religious idols, and the importance of the copper trade as being this thing that the god is actually standing on there. The other really interesting example we have of this is from Kition, where we have this large temple happening here, and this again you can see these ashlar stones that make up the base of it. What's particularly interesting about this is that right next to the temple, and in fact communicating with the temple through a doorway, there are a series of copper workshops that you can see just above that. Between the city wall and Temple 1, there are a number of these workshops. We think also there may have been a port just outside the city wall. So the temple may be situated in a way where it's controlling the production of copper and possibly also the exporting of copper as well. So that's one of the ways that Cyprus is adapting to this period in the late Bronze Age, the last couple of centuries of the Bronze Age, from about 1200 to 1050 BC. The religion is somehow connected with the copper trade. We find that these items are being made on a smaller scale, but also the Cypriots are pivoting a bit in terms of using their technology for other purposes, and what they start getting into is iron working and trade. Now, iron is a brand new technology at that time. It's more difficult to work than bronze, but the Cypriots are able to use their metallurgical skills and adapt them to iron, and this puts Cyprus in a really useful position. There are lots of iron sources that it can access. It doesn't require tin, which has to be transported from further away. And Cyprus becomes a major iron exporter, an iron goods exporter, such as this iron knife. So with these various adaptations, Cyprus is able to continue to function. It's able to continue to flourish. In fact, society transforms during this period, but it doesn't actually collapse. And in fact, Cyprus is now set up to do an important player in rebooting the Eastern Mediterranean trade networks, which starts to happen in the 8th century BC, and the introduction of the Iron Age, which is happening during this period as well. So Cyprus is now well placed to get into that and plays a really important role in getting Greece and other places up and running again after the collapse that happens at the end of the Bronze Age. That's a story for another time, so I'm going to finish up there. and happy to take some questions.
Oh, Chris, that was really fascinating. You took us back to over 1000 BC years ago, gave us a real sense of how people lived, how they traded, what they purchased. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
So if people have questions for Chris, I know he'd be very happy to answer them. Chris, I was fascinated by those round clay balls with the script on them. Do you think there's ever any chance that anyone will work out what is said on those tablets and those balls? Or do you think that's a secret now lost to history?
Well, in order to figure it out, we're going to need to figure out what kind of language it is. And so far, every attempt to find a related language to try to map onto it has been unsuccessful. Part of that, though, is that there's only about 250 inscriptions in Cypro-Minoan, so there's not a large quantity. And it's even been suggested that there may be more than one language that's being written down there to further complicate things. So it could be that if there are some more inscriptions, and particularly some larger ones, a lot of them are quite short inscriptions, like there's not a lot written on those little clay balls. It may be that if we manage to find some larger inscriptions, maybe something will happen, but I think I wouldn't be holding my breath for that anytime. All the efforts to use related languages from that area have not managed to provide any success in trying to actually map it onto what we find there.
Now, any other questions that anyone would like to ask?
Yes, I was interested in that collapse. I don't know very much history, ancient history at all, but you said that there were signs of destruction. Climate change had been part of that collapse?
So this is a really heavily debated point, is what caused this Bronze Age collapse, and there are a lot of theories, and there does definitely appear to be a climatic shift in this period which may have contributed to it, I think. But there's a whole lot of other factors that have been suggested as well. It may have been movement of people, it may have been diseases sweeping through there as well. The most sort of convincing to me is to suggest that it's actually probably a whole bunch of factors occurring at the same time. That there are things like the climatic, so there was a climatic change. We know things became a bit drier, which would have reduced productivity. That probably wouldn't have been enough in itself to lead to societal collapse. But when you combine that together with a number of other stresses all occurring at the same time, that may have made a kind of perfect storm where you get what's referred to as a systems collapse, that the system can't compensate for the various stresses and the whole thing collapses. So it's a really interesting question, and as to what has caused that collapse, and it's a really heavily debated point of view, and there's a lot of different theories. The climate's a really interesting one. Ancient climate science is a relatively new area of science, and we're finding a lot of correlations of climate change happening at the same time as various historical events, but the science, I think, is still relatively early on for us to know how much of an effect that had.
Chris, I wonder if it could be earthquakes.
There certainly are earthquakes that happen in this part of the world, and we find evidence for destruction there. The Bronze Age collapse is so widespread that earthquakes would only be a very local factor, but this collapse of Greece to right across to Iraq, essentially, so a very, very large area.
Can I ask what the scene is in your background? What archaeological spot is that behind you?
Yeah, that's the city of Paphos on Cyprus. So that's actually the Roman Odeon. So that was actually a theatre from Roman times.
And included in your tour, I'm sure.
It is indeed included in the tour, so you can see the thing for real if you come along.
Well, I'd like to say a very big thanks to Chris Gribbin for giving us such an enlightening, fascinating historical talk. I feel I've been taken to Cyprus this evening and learned an enormous amount about its history. And I know that Chris's tour of Cyprus is going to be absolutely gorgeous. Thank you to everybody for joining us this evening for Travel Tuesdays. And a very, very big thank you to Chris for giving us such a fascinating and enlightening talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.